Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mary Lee Kiernan, President and CEO of YWCA Greenwich, and I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's event entitled Dispelling Myths, Critical Race Theory, and Talking About Racism. I'm welcoming you this evening on behalf of the other three YWCAs in the state, YWCA Darien Norwalk, YWCA Hartford Region, and YWCA New Britain. This is a jointly sponsored event by all the YWCAs in the state who share the same mission of eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Given the national, state, and regional discussions ongoing right now that center on critical race theory, our YWCAs felt responsible. We felt it was imperative to bring together a panel of experts this evening to help dispel myths around critical race theory, explore the value of discussing race and racism in institutional settings such as schools, share research on race and child development, hear on-the-ground school experiences with race and racism, talk about the implications of this moment for our schools and our children, and raise up what this all means for our capacity to eliminate racism from our communities. Our moderator this evening is Erin O. Crosby, who is the Director of Women's Empowerment and Racial Justice at YWCA Greenwich and leads our new Center for Equity and Justice. Erin brings years of experience in race equity and women's empowerment and is completing a doctorate degree in PK-12 educational leadership at SMU's School of Education and Human Development. Thank you, Erin, for your moderation this evening and your outstanding work on tonight's event. And thank you in advance to our esteemed panelists for their time and their expertise. We are enormously grateful for your participation this evening. After the panel discussion, we would like to take questions from the audience, which can be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can submit these questions during the panel discussion or during the Q&A session. Please know that after this evening, we will send you an email with a link to the recording of tonight's events, with slides we show tonight, with speaker bios, and other resources related to tonight's topic. Thank you again for attending this evening. And now let me turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Mary Lee, and thank you to everyone who's joining us for this important conversation. Before we get started, I want to bring together the near past and the present as it's important framing for this conversation. As many of you know, in 2020, Connecticut became the first state in the country to require high schools to provide courses on Black and Latinx studies. This was bipartisan legislation, and it was the result of statewide student advocacy and the leadership of State Representative Bobby Gibson and State Senator Doug McCrory. It acknowledged the importance of people of color in the American story, and it recognized that more inclusive, culturally relevant content in classrooms leads to greater student engagement and better outcomes for all students. Other states have begun to make similar strides. Since 2016, 13 other states and 1 district have passed legislation related to ethnic studies. In what many would characterize as a long overdue step, these states were acknowledging that the experiences, narratives, and contributions of people of color had too often been misrepresented or excluded from teaching and learning, and that our children are regularly confronted with race and racism inside and outside of their schools, and that they needed to be able to better understand those experiences. They also needed to know how our past informs our present, even when it's uncomfortable. Following the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning it sparked, attacks on critical race theory began to emerge. Those attacks have resulted in 27 states, as of last month, introducing bills or taking steps that would restrict teaching critical race theory or limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism. This is all despite school leaders across the country emphasizing that critical race theory is not being taught in our schools. Tonight, we're going to explore the juxtaposition of these two realities with our panelists. So let me introduce them. First, we have Dr. Terrell Hill. He's the superintendent of Windsor Public Schools. We also have with us Judge Angela Robinson, who's retired and a visiting professor at Quinnipiac School of Law. We also have with us Dr. Jess Sullivan, who's an associate professor of psychology at Skidmore College, and Michelle Wansley Ford, executive director of the Center for Racial Justice in Education. Thank you to each of you for joining us, and let's get into this conversation. I want to start with you, Michelle. We should not have any conversation about race or racism without defining both. So let's start with you defining for us what is race and what is racism.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this conversation tonight. It is wonderful to be able to speak to other folks who are deeply interested in and committed to fostering understanding. At the Center for Racial Justice and Education, we begin in the very same place, Erin, which is, that we need to understand not just a definition of race for the purpose of terminology, but we need to understand the historical construction of race, right? And so when we talk about race, it is important for us to begin with how race came to even be a thing, a classifier in this American context, in the United States of America in particular. And so the way that we try to help folks think about this is, one, we underscore the fact that it has historical roots based on, physical attributes of appearance, based on shared culture that may be different from one's own. And we chart over time how race gets constructed and categorized, and how each of us then gets slotted into a categorization of race. We talk a bit about the work of a German physician and an anthropologist, and that combination is significant and dangerous, we will come to find, but his name is Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and we talk about how in the 1770s, he creates a construction of race that includes Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American, which we come to understand later as Native or Indigenous people, right? And so this construction is not it's not something that is brought with folks as they come from Europe to settle here in what would become the United States of America. But there is a distinction that is physical that they draw that then becomes reinforced by the intellectual thought of the day, right? And these ideas were not dismissed out of hand. And you have folks who are founding fathers in the United States who are looking for intellectual reasons to reinforce the differences that are created for the purpose of acquiring and retaining power based on property ownership, based on wealth accumulation, based on the ability to have representation in the emergent government, right? And so race becomes a construct that is sustained and then litigated over time, right? And so we go from what becomes a biological construction of race, which is inaccurate and specious, to say the least, to a legal construction of race, right? And that begins as early as 1790, right? The Naturalization Acts of 1790, of 1870, moves, on into the present moment where we're looking at issues of citizenship. We won't even get to sort of the imagery that we have been reminded of in terms of, our Haitian refugees who are at our borders right now, right? And the way in which they are being treated as they seek asylum in this country. And so what we know is that race is a social construct. It is one that then is used to separate people from access, to separate them from power, and is perpetuated largely by people who are descended of European colonial settlers, right? And so when we think about the conversation of race in this country, when we think about its origins, let us not forget that we often forget the first harm, which is that there were people who lived here and thrived here
Mhm.
before anyone arrived on our shores. So that is, a construction of race. And when we think about that as a construction of race, we get into what racism is, right? Which is racial prejudice plus power. And it is so important that we have that distinction of the plus power, because often, when we are having conversations with folks and we are inviting them to interrogate their understanding of race and racism in this country, we will have conversations with folks, and questions will arise. Well, can't everyone be racist, right? And it's a valid question, and one that we have to dig into as we think about, well, who has access to systemic power, right? Racism is distinct from racial prejudice, is distinct from racial bias. We are all biased people. We all have prejudices, and they are rooted in any number of things. But when we think about racism, and we talk about this at CRJE in 4 different ways, we spend a lot of time thinking about systemic racism, thinking about institutional racism. And so, from our perspective, the conversation that we invite folks into is that racism is racial prejudice plus power.
Mhm. Thank you for that. And thank you for the historical context for it. Like, I think it's always important for people to know that the things that we live with today were not always created today. They're things that we inherit. They're things that are very complex. And even though we know that racism is a social construct, we also have to recognize in the ways in which it has become codified. In many ways, it's become part of the legal system, like we've seen it show up in those ways. And so it's got these very real implications for our lived experiences. And I'm often in conversations with people where we say, well, what if we just got rid of the racial categories? Like, what if we just didn't pay attention to that anymore? And I think it's always important to say to people, but we've got this thing now that's really baked into the fabric of our society. And that's actually what we're trying to untangle, not just the labels. We're trying to untangle the implications of it. And that's a great segue. Thanks for setting that up for us. That I'm thinking about you, Angela. You are a retired judge. You are now a professor, and you do teach critical race theory. Important to say, you teach it to law students. And so I'd love for you to just take our audience through, and we got many questions about this. What is critical race theory? What isn't it? And so I'll just give you a few minutes. I know you're going to share your screen to talk with us about that.
I am going to share my screen, and I want to thank you for that wonderful setup, Michelle, because you gave the overview for the context within which critical race theory came to be. And I just need to say at the outset, I do teach critical race theory at Quinnipiac University School of Law to law students, but the opinions that I give today are my own. They're not reflective of any policy of the university, other than the fact that they support the teaching of critical race theory. So when I think about what critical race theory is, simply put, it's a way that was constructed in academia to look at the problem of racism and racial disparity, and to explore the role that race plays in our society. So it provided a space, especially within academia, for voices of color to speak about racialized experiences. And the movement officially began in 1989 in Madison, Wisconsin. I always joke and say, I don't know what's in the water of Madison, but it has been the home for many radical think-sounding movements. And so critical race theory actually did start in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989 at a workshop that was convened by law professors and legal scholars. And the early law professors who organized it were Kimberly Crenshaw, who's still a major force within critical race theory, has promoted such notions as intersectionality. And she was actually the one who came up with the name critical race theory. And she said she did that because she wanted to help develop a coherent account of race and the law. And one of the things that they wanted to trace was how the law created and perpetuated racism, the racial structure that exists within our society. In a very real sense, race and racism could not exist without the law. And so they brought these new thinkers together to Madison, Wisconsin, to start thinking about different ways to look at the law and to look at the role it played in establishing and creating race. From its beginning, it was an interdisciplinary approach. So it drew on lots of different disciplines like history and eventually neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, sociology, and social studies. And it has taken off and been very successful in seeding other movements and other disciplines. So it's now gone beyond law into other disciplines. But what's really important to remember is that it started out as a formal study primarily in law schools and graduate schools. And to a lesser extent, now it is taught in colleges and universities. But to put it into perspective, there are about 3,900 colleges and universities in the United States. And of those, only about 300 colleges actually teach critical race theory. So while you might find classes about it at the college and university level, it's really something that you're going to be introduced to more at the graduate school level. And it is not taught at the elementary, primary, or secondary school level. Let's be clear about what it is not. Critical race theory is not teaching American history. So American history that incorporates the experiences of people of color or the immigrant experience is not critical race theory. Topics that relate to racial identity are not necessarily critical race theory. Teaching about racism in a broader societal context is not critical race theory. Critical race theory is, in fact, a very big tent that incorporates a lot of different theorists who don't always agree with each other. But the three pillars that unite it are three concepts. Critical race theorists believe that race is a social construct, that racism is pervasive, structural, and systemic, and that a colorblind approach will not help us undo the problems of racism. So despite the relatively benign history in that it grew out of the law, extended to different disciplines, and is an effort to undo the problems of racial inequity, it has become the focus of controversy. In 4 months, Fox News mentioned it 1,300 times. And there are dozens of states that are now working very hard to combat what they call critical race theory. In my opinion, the attacks on critical race theory are just the latest version of people trying to use tools of racial division to create anxiety, particularly among white Americans. So my takeaways as we go into this discussion are critical race theory is not new. It's been around for decades, and it's based on foundations that were around for even more. It is not a threat to democracy. It really continues the work of other social justice efforts. It's a discipline that one is not going to encounter in primary or secondary school. You're not even often going to encounter it at college. You're primarily going to encounter it at graduate school. And it pursues the concept of racial equity for everyone. So it can't be fully taught in a semester, let alone a night, let alone the 10 minutes that I'm giving you. But it is here, I think, to stay for the benefit of us all. So I will stop my share at that point and turn it back over to Erin.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I really appreciate you for making this distinction about what it is not, because I'm thinking about the ways in which many things have been conflated right now with critical race theory. And it really provides an important sort of point that we're going to start to make tonight, is that there is critical race theory and where it exists. There's also the fallout that has come because of attacks on critical race theory. And one of the things we're really going to sort of dive in tonight is what are the implications of this on being able to talk about the things that you said critical race theory is not, which is how do we talk about racial identity development? How do we teach history? How do we talk about racism in this country? So those things are not critical race theory, but the ability to talk about those things is now potentially under threat. And we see that truly in terms of the legislation that's being passed. So, you know, I would be remiss if I did not pass the mic, as they say, over to Dr. Hill, because at the center of these attacks have really been PK through 12 education, which even though, Angela, you have made clear, as others have said, this is not being taught in those settings. Our school administrators, our teachers are being asked to speak to whether or not it's being taught and pointing to things that say it is being taught. So Dr. Hill, I'd love to hear from you about really, how are you as a superintendent dealing with these claims about critical race theory being taught in our schools?
Thank you. So first I'd like to say, Aaron, thank you and the YWCA organization for inviting me and having me on this panel. I'm always honored when someone asks you to come somewhere to speak and share your thoughts. And it's always an even greater honor when you get to be on a panel with such incredible people. I think that Michelle and Angela laid the foundation right away. I was like shaking my head while they were talking. And just something I thought about, race is, race is a social construct. And I just thought to myself, it's a social construct of convenience, right? Used for when they need it. Like, as you said, they went through the legalization to justify the inhumane treatment of another human being from another country. But that's not my question, right? So no, we're not teaching it in schools. And I can completely back up what Angela said. As a student completing my dissertation some years ago, that was the first time I came across CRT. So when I started hearing, the rants out there about, oh, they're teaching this, and I'm looking around like, well, what did I miss all my years in, K to 12? I just found this working on the dissertation. This is not something that's in our schools. And, what I believe it is, it's part of what's been going on for, a number of years now, right? So it's just a clarion call to get folks, particularly white Americans, amped up about the takeover. That's the terminology that I use, like that the folks of color are multiplying and they're going to be the majority by this year. I've been hearing this for the last 30 years. And so somehow we've got to find a way as white folks to galvanize and spark the soldiers, and the soldiers being, even legislators, right, to change laws. So we've mentioned a few times already about states and their legislative efforts. I just want to clarify that currently there are 8 states that have actually passed legislation, and I've talked to colleagues who've done, they're into this work and they've been in these states since the legislation has passed, and they're like, Dr. Hill, it's surreal when you go and before you speak, you're told, do not mention race. Do not say this. I want you to make it home. I don't want you arrested, and I don't want you fined. So we are living in that America. And what I like to say that in schools, in asking for a more open and diverse curriculum, expanding, the canon, as it were, we're not asking anyone to displace anyone else's history, nor to diminish anyone else's contributions. However, we think it's time that all contributions from the various groups are shared openly and fairly. And I don't understand as an educator why that has become such a hot point, right? As I watch the news and I see the clips and I see, these angry parents with, just their emotions. And it's just interesting to me that, what is it that you're losing? What's being taken away from you? But for decades and centuries have you, folks of color have never had their fair share of recognition or their fair share of anything in academia that was considered worthy or at least comparable to what, white educators did. So there's nothing that's being done right now that's, to take away from someone else. And I think it's actually a time that all educators need to continue to push the envelope and do what they know is best for all students. And we're going to have folks who are going to keep crying out and screaming and yelling. And, that's just par for the course. When change comes, it never comes without some kind of, pain. And I think that's where we're at right now in this country. We're just hearing the utterings of people who are in pain because what they've been taught and believed in, as you said, it's part of the fabric now, right? It's not just a checkbox on an application. So, when I have these conversations with folks, I'm like, you were socialized to believe certain things. And it's devastating when you start to actually realize that how you were socialized in society actually was a lie. And, maybe you're not the greatest on the planet. Maybe you don't know everything. Maybe you weren't the first at everything. Maybe someone who looks nothing like you did something just as great that you actually benefit from today. Did you ever consider that? And that's hard for people who've bought, the mass message, hook, line, and sinker. And I'm glad that we're at this time in our society where the conversation is not just in classrooms at colleges, but it's coming front and center, in general, not CRT, but the conversation about how important it is for us to teach about all races and all contributions and to expand, the curriculum.
And what stands, I want to open up the floor if anybody wants to add to that. So I'll just build on that by saying one of the things that I'm really struck by is Angela mentioned, this sort of threat for us to be able to talk about race and racism in schools sort of stands in opposition to the reality that students hold racial identities in their schools, as do their teachers, as do their parents, and that they are experiencing acts of racism, whether they be institutional, whether they be interpersonal. And so I'm just wondering if any of you would like to just frame for our audience, when we talk about what happens in schools, what does race and racism look like in the daily experiences or in the system of education?
They're directed to.
That can be, go for it, Dr. Hill.
I don't want to monopolize. I was like, let me see who wanted to start that one off. But I'll say this, and maybe it'll spark folks to just jump in. But some of the research that I covered in my dissertation, or I'll say one of the lines is that the whole racism without racists, right? So when we talk about racism, I think one of the reasons why white Americans get sparked up, because they envision, like, they all see themselves as not being racist as an individual. And they think of racism as the person in the sheet and the flaming torch, grabbing out some Black person from their home in the middle of the night. While we know that is definitely part of our history, no matter how much people want to hide that, it is. That is not what we're talking about. And when we talk about, the true power of racism, I believe Michelle spoke to that. We're talking about the laws, things that get enacted that become the absolute foundation of a society. That's where the problem is. And if we don't think it's alive, just look at all the actions beyond CRT that are happening with voter rights. And why are states doing what they're doing? If everything's equal and everyone, we're on our own merit, why are we moving in those directions in various states? So I'm just hoping that gets, my colleagues going. I don't want to monopolize.
Well, and one of the things that I'm really struck by is, one, what does it mean when we think about how race and racism shows up in school? I'm struck by a couple of things. One, what does it mean for educators to be in classrooms where issues of race and racism come up and they feel ill-equipped to address that? I think we're seeing a lot of states right now. I know the former state that I lived in Dallas, where I was living, this reality of how systemic racism has informed our expulsion and some suspension policy. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. But I'd love to hear anybody chime in, maybe you, Michelle, particularly because I know about the work of your organization. What does it mean for a teacher to be in a classroom and be dealing with race and racism and feel ill-equipped or equipped to deal with it? Let's think about both sides of it. You're on mute.
Yep. I have a mug that says that. I need to say it to myself. How racism manifests in schools and how our educators are and aren't equipped to address it. I mean, it really can be just a heartbreaking experience, right? For educators who have chosen this line of work, who want to be there for students, who want to be able to lead students to an experience of self-discovery and discovery of the world, and then to find themselves kind of hamstrung when they witness things between students, when they witness things between their colleagues, when they have an exchange with a student, with a family, with a parent, with an administrator, and just be lost for words, right? And I've heard tonight as we talk about, Angela mentioned the distinction between critical race theory and American history, right? Those things are not the same. But when we don't, to Dr. Hill's point, when we don't have an understanding, an accurate understanding of American history, it then just sort of pulls the rug out from under educators, who would otherwise be able to contextualize what they're observing, what they're experiencing, right? And so, I reflect back on my own experience as a student and how even in some of the best resource places, I was really fortunate to attend a school here in New York as a scholarship student. And, my experience there was sandwiched between the Rodney King trial and the LA riots and the OJ Simpson trial. And so to be there in the 90s, having conversations or not having conversations about race and racism was fascinating because we were surrounded by teachers who loved us, teachers who poured into us, teachers who told us that we could do and be anything. And then we're sitting in a room and this verdict comes down and you could hear a pin drop. And, to have the experience as a student, that was really probably the beginning of understanding that educators have limitations, right? And so the work of the Center for Racial Justice in Education is just to acknowledge that, right? And to acknowledge, to Dr. Hill's point, that it's contextual, that we have all been socialized a particular way, right? The distinction is that in some households, there are different conversations happening to counter the prevailing narrative. And those conversations are not happening in all households. And so then you have students who are showing up in school and they're saying, well, that's not what I learned at home, right? Whether that is what they learned at home was accurate or not, right? And so what it looks like in schools is decisions being made in moments, snap decisions by educators who don't have a sense of context, to your point, Erin, who don't understand the disparate impact of disciplinary actions, right? Who don't understand why a student, if they're in an environment where they're required to wear a uniform, may show up and the uniform doesn't look the way it's supposed to, right? Mm-hmm. Or a student hasn't done their homework. And just looking at the last year and a half, right? As I mentioned, I'm the parent of a second grader. And, just the experience of students now being in class at home, if possible, if they have access to technology, if they have access to, someone to help supervise or manage their education, right? And just the difference between where people chose to be during the last 18 months and where they had to be during the last 18 months. So it looks any number of ways, and the sort of what they call the twin pandemics of the great awakening of systemic racism and the pervasive nature of racism paired with, COVID. It has tapped our educators out such that when they start the school year, it's like, congratulations for surviving the worst school year ever. Welcome to the worst school year ever.
Well, and I'm thinking about this piece about learning. So like you've named this thing for us, Michelle, that's really, teachers are being confronted with this. We all know that what happens at home or doesn't happen at home sometimes shows up at school. And there's so much about this that's really about teaching and learning. Like, what is the role of school? How does learning happen? How do children learn? And so I'm going to do this a little bit in reverse. One, I want to think about really what are the implications of talking about race, not talking about race, on children's social skills, how they learn, how they sort of understand groups. And Jess, I want to pass that to you. Really talk about the implications of this for children's learning in social groups and what they learn when we avoid topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So as probably anyone who's ever been around a kid has noticed, they are really good observers, right? They notice their world and they're really social, right? So they're paying really close attention to who is like me and not like me. They're paying close attention to who talks to one another, and they're paying close attention to social groups, right? And sometimes that looks like friend groups or neighborhood groups or who's on the block with you or who's on a team with you. And sometimes those groups look like the kinds of categories you check on a census box, right? So racial categories, gender categories, categories based on what language you speak. And kids are noticing all of it. So in a little bit, I'm going to kind of review some of the information about what kids are noticing when. But the really critical idea here is that young children are paying attention to race and how race is used in their environment. And so there's kind of two options. One option is we can just let them go ahead and make whatever guesses they want about what it is they're seeing and experiencing and try to make sense of it on their own. Or if that doesn't sound good to you, and it doesn't sound good to me, the other option is to speak with kids about race and about racism in an age-appropriate way. Because when you don't talk to kids about race, and we have very good data about this, when you say race is not something we talk about, this is in particular an approach that white parents are much more likely to take. Say we're all the same on the inside, we shouldn't notice race, race is not an issue anymore, racism isn't an issue anymore. When you say that, kids learn that it's a topic not to be discussed. And so they learn to stop talking about it and stop asking questions about it, right? I've had students in my class be like, am I allowed to say Black when we're talking about race categories in a psychology paper, right? Because they're not sure. Right? And so this idea that it's a topic that is off limits is really damaging to encouraging the important conversations that we need to have about the legal structures and the educational structures that allow racism to persist. But it's also really damaging in promoting new conversations, because one of the most common things I hear from parents when I say, hey, why didn't you talk to kids about race recently? Is they say, it didn't come up. And that can mean a lot of things. Right? It can mean a lot of things, but one thing it can mean is that whether you've tried to or not, children may have gotten the message that race is not a topic to speak to others about. And so if as a parent or an educator, you're waiting for a child to bring it up, they may be intentionally avoiding it because they know from you and your actions or the actions of others in their community that it is not an okay thing to talk about. It's not okay at the dinner table. It's not okay in the classroom. It's not okay with your friends. And so then the kid doesn't ask, and the parent or the educator is waiting for the kid to ask, and you get stuck in this eternal cycle of silence, which we know is really harmful.
And just, I think I know the answer to this, but when you're saying this, we don't talk about race or it doesn't come up at home, am I correct in saying that this is something that largely exists in white households? Because families of color, I imagine, and particularly Black families, are having conversations about race and
Absolutely.
racism.
And so I'll definitely talk about kind of how often conversations are happening among white parents and their kids relative to Black parents and their kids. But in general, when any human avoids a topic, right, a child learns from that. Right? And so on average, everything I'm saying is applying more to white parents than to parents of color. But the general principle of learning, which is you say, oh no, we don't talk about that, I think is general.
Can I just pop in super quickly to say, I think one of the things, Jess, that you share that is so critically important that folks understand is when we explicitly or implicitly teach kids not to talk about race, what happens is they end up forming these relationships across racial lines, right? And then it is completely destabilizing when something that is rooted in race takes place, right? To this day, my classmates, we go back to that conversation and people can remember where they were sitting in the homeroom, which teachers were present, when we were on sports teams together, we were in choruses together, we did homework together, and then this moment occurred and it fractured those relationships because folks were just missing each other, right? And so, the longstanding impact of that is that it's destabilizing for young people if they don't fully understand the difference, right, in the ways that their communities, their families are or are not talking about race if they are having what they believe to be a racially equitable friendship, right, relationship. I went back to teach at that school 20 years later, and some of my high school seniors voted for the first time in 2016. And I taught at a school that was founded for girls. So there was, a leaning, right, in terms of the community. And students came back and they were devastated. How could this happen? This is not the world we live in, right? But the world that they live in terms of their conscious minds, if they were at the oldest 19, the years that preceded that election, those of us who were older understood to be extraordinarily anomalous in terms of who lived in that administration, right? And so, absent that conversation, the devastation was just the day shut down for those students, right? And for the educators who could not support them to say, this is a thing that has happened, and let us explain to you what it all means and why there's such there are such different experiences happening in terms of what anyone thought was going to happen as a result of the 2016 election. And so it's important to just note that.
So I'd like to add to that too, that because the crux of this question is, the educators and what happens in the school. And I think both what Jess and Michelle just said, I don't think it's an accident. So that's me. I don't think any of it's an accident. Former colleague at Springfield College, Dr. Barbie Harrow, in her dissertation study many years back, she talked about the cycle of socialization, which I mentioned. Socialization, people are taught. It's a deliberate thing. I don't care how nice we try to make it sound, right? Like my parents never talked about race. I hear that so much, like across the table, and it's what Jess said, right? We don't talk about that. You're teaching when you're either speaking or you're not speaking. Kids are learning. And these kids become adults who take on various roles in society. For this conversation tonight, I'm gonna focus on those who become teachers. So, we have a heavy lift, we being the leaders, because we now have to bring in organizations and folks like Michelle and Jess who are specifically trained to help break down, and not just break down, but rebuild folks on the fly, because they're still teaching kids every single day. So if I have teachers in classrooms who were socialized to believe, a certain thing about race or how they're supposed to interact or whether or not they're supposed to talk about it, and then these things are happening to students, particularly, students of color and our white students. Like we always make it like it's one or the other, but the white students are being damaged just as much as the students of color, because what we're doing is we're perpetuating, those negative socialization, techniques. So like when they see, young black folks being killed by police officers for apparently no reason, right? That's why people can, rail against the Black Lives Matter when, students started taking to the streets last summer. Then we started hearing about Blue Lives Matter and these lives matter, so, that's what helps generate or become the genesis for those kinds of arguments, because folks have never really had the conversations. They've just been from generation to generation. And the one thing that I've been saying in my little stump speech, for the last, 6 to 8 months, is that I'm thanking God for the millennials now. As much as they get grief from folks, particularly my generation and others, they have decided it's time out for the gradual progression. It is time out for a side conversation. We're going to have this conversation up front, in person, and we want to see some changes. And we can't keep, whispering, as Jess said. It can't be, don't talk about that. No, let's talk about it. And so when I hear politicians and I see parents, on the news, raging about CRT and we can't talk about this, what I really see is a person who is in total fear of everything that they've been taught to believe being brought to the ground and having to rebuild on the fly. Those people are in our classrooms. It doesn't make our teachers bad. I want to be very clear about that. These are people who went to school and they are trying to, exact their profession. And what happens to us in the midst of our plans? Life happens. So this is real, right? So I didn't go to, I have teachers deal. I didn't go to school to talk about race. I didn't go, well, you're never going to talk about race because society told you not to. I'll liken it to, for folks listening out there, it's the same thing growing. I was a business major, not an education major, and growing to school in the 80s, they always told you, besides how to dress, don't talk about salary, right? You just learn that, don't talk about salary. Well, the reason why you don't talk about salary is because they didn't want people to know that there was a complete discriminatory practices going on when it came to salary, right? So you working next to Jim, and all of a sudden you find out Jim's making $30,000 more than you, and you guys doing the same job.
Mhm.
Or you working next to Sally and you feel like you find out she's making $30,000 less than you and you're doing the same job. Well, why is Jim making more money? Why is Sally making less money? So the powers that be don't want those conversations to happen. And so the key in the core to all of this is that we have to begin talking. And we got to talk beyond people's emotions. So I'm gonna stop there. We can't stop at the tears every time we have a conversation. We got to go past the tears and break down and then rebuild, on the fly, because we can't stop society.
Mhm. Mhm.
Can I add something to this? I've been quiet because critical race theory really is not taught at the school level, but if we're talking about educators, I definitely feel there are tools within critical race theory that all people who are being trained to be teachers should be aware of and should be using. So I definitely think that we've conflated this whole anti-racism work with critical race theory work, with race equity work. And I don't want us to miss the fact that if you're a professional who is serving the public in any professional capacity, I think you need to have some basic rudimentary understanding of race and society. And critical race theory can be a good opening to that.
Mhm. Mhm. And Angela, I think your point is so spot on, because it's important to say critical race theory is a theory. It is a framework. It is designed for people to be able to wrestle with how so many of these things persisted. And so it's that moment in which we say, the fact that we are having these conversations about critical race theory and all the things that it's been conflated with is because of the absence of us to be able to interrogate and talk honestly about these things. And so we constantly find, like I think in this moment, like when I think about what happened after the murder of George Floyd, I saw us running towards something boldly to correct some things that we had let stick for so long. And I also see a group of people running now away from that, or trying to keep those people who are running forward for the collective good from making progress. And really what I see in the midst of it is, no critical race theory is not being taught in schools. But isn't it time that we start to interrogate why some of these things have persisted so that we can do something in the future? And I also think about what are the ways that it means, and Jess, I'm going to pass the mic to you here shortly, is to say, I think so often, this is also personal opinion, what does it mean for a parent? And I say this as a parent. What does it mean for a parent not to equip their children to dismantle things that are harmful to other people and themselves? And I think that's something that's really important to say. And Dr. Hill, you touched on this. Racism is not just harmful to people of color. It is particularly violent and harmful to people of color, but it is also harmful and violent to white people. And it is the reason that we are still in this moment that we're in now. And that seems like I want to segue to Jess, and I've seen y'all, I'm paying attention to the questions that we're getting, and we do want to have time for that. And that's why I want to go to Jess, because I've seen several questions come up, really where people want to know more about, like, how do we have these conversations with kids? What do you mean when you say avoiding these topics becomes challenging or problematic? So Jess, I want to go to you. I know your research that you've been doing recently really focuses on how and why adults talk with children about race. So you're going to share your presentation. And I just want to say also, y'all, part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation is we realized that the implications of not having these conversations also impacts child development and children's social skills. So Jess, take it from here.
Awesome, thank you. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm a psychologist, which means the kind of information I use comes from research studies. So I'm going to try to stick very closely to what these studies say and what they don't say. And I'm just gonna blast through, like, why talk about race with kids? Are these conversations happening? If not, why not? What can kids think about? What can't they think about? Like, what is developmentally appropriate for children? So I have about 10 minutes here. I'll do my best to get through it all. So why talk with kids about race. We've talked about a lot of reasons already in the panel. I'm going to kind of stick to some of the main findings. So like, how do kids directly benefit from these conversations? So aside from the larger goal of dismantling racism and like harmful structures that exist in our society, how about like your individual child? What are the benefits? So when we talk about race and ethnicity constructively, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what constructively means here. Children have all sorts of good outcomes. So children develop more empathy for others, so their empathy scores get higher. They learn about new perspectives. They understand elements of their own identity in a way that is different from before they engaged in those conversations. So they learn something about themselves. White children have been shown to avoid engaging in some practices that reproduce structural inequality, at least in the lab, right? Obviously, children aren't lawmakers. They're not in positions of power at all in our society, but within the lab, they'll do that. And will even exhibit less racial bias in the lab. So really clear evidence that there are benefits to children for talking about race and ethnicity in a productive way. And yet, most white adults adopt what's known as a colorblind approach to talking about race, if it even happens at all. And so what that looks like is, you know, kind of the melting pot, right? We're all the same, we all come together into kind of, we're all just humans, right? Ignore race, children don't see race, no one should see race. That kind of narrative is called colorblindness, and it's actively harmful. All right, it's been shown through a number of studies with both children and adults that is a harmful way to talk about race, and it doesn't lead to productive conversations. In addition, we see that white adults are often avoiding conversations about race. And so let's think a little bit about how often these conversations are happening. So are conversations about race between children and adults happening? The answer is, of course, yes, but not equally. Right? So what we see is that most white parents actually say they rely on school to teach their children about race, which is ironic given the conversation we're having today. And in fact, by one estimate, 56% of white parents say they seldom or never talk about racial heritage. Okay, and so these are just 2 data points. I'll show you some more. Demonstrating that white parents are tending not to engage with conversations about race with their children and instead are saying, let someone else do it. That happens in school, that happens elsewhere. This is in stark contrast to our studies of Black parents, where depending on the study, we see that about 67 to 95% of Black parents report actively and proactively talking with their children about race and racial bias. And I will note, I'm talking about how often these conversations are happening. The conversations that are occurring also look very different between white parents and Black parents on average, and I just don't have time to talk about it with you guys today. In one study, we wanted to just get a snapshot of like, okay, what does your last week look like? So we just said, hey, in the last week, did you talk to your children about race? White parents said yes about half of the time. But a lot of times we learned that those conversations were very superficial and often implied colorblindness. Non-Black parents of color in the US said yes 66.2% of time, and Black parents said yes 85.7% of the time. Okay, so we see that these conversations are happening within the home at very different rates, and that white parents in general are avoiding these conversations. And so we have to ask, like, well, why aren't these conversations happening? And we've talked about a lot of possible reasons. I'm going to add on to them, though. And these are some other reasons that these conversations aren't happening. And I'm sharing this with you in part because if you are in the audience right now and you're saying, you know, I want more conversations about race and racism with children, maybe the first step is figuring out what those barriers are so we can figure out how to overcome them. So why do adults, and in particular white adults, avoid these conversations? Well, white parents often report fear of appearing racially biased. And so the parent will say, if I talk about race, then I'm going to appear racist. Now, we have great evidence that that actually backfires. If you avoid talking about race because you think it's going to make you look racist, that does not work, okay? On average, you will be perceived as more racist if you avoid talking about race. White parents also often report low levels of personal experience of racial inequality. We know that parents use their own personal experiences to talk with children about all sorts of topics. And so feeling like, you know, I have not personally experienced racial inequality in a way that I understand, right? That first pass reaction can cause adults to hesitate to talk to kids about race. And white parents often can report low levels of bias awareness, just not seeing the bias that is there, and therefore not addressing it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, parents of color and white parents do sometimes avoid conversations in particular contexts. And so parents across racial groups, and I see no race effects for any of these, also report the following. It didn't come up, we talked about that earlier. That may mean different things in different households, right? But the idea is that we're hoping that a child will initiate a conversation, and sometimes that doesn't happen. There's a fear of the child getting it wrong, misunderstanding, right? Hearing something and understanding it the wrong way. That's a very reasonable fear, right? Children do not have the same skills adults have. They don't have the same cognitive skills. And so there is a real concern that parents have about how to deliver a developmentally appropriate message. Parents also report fear of burdening the child, right? Parents report fear of discomfort of the conversation. And I want to be clear that in the studies that we've looked at, white parents and parents of color report the same amount of discomfort and like, ooh, this is like not pleasant for me. I don't want to do this. The difference is that for white parents on average, that's causing them to avoid the conversation, right? And we're not seeing that among parents of color. Finally, there's this belief that children just don't think about race, or they're not able to, or they lack the skills to do it. And one of my studies showed that this was the best predictor out of everything of whether or not adults were going to talk with young children about race. And one of the cool things is this study also showed that if I teach you about what children know and think about race, that actually on average will make you more willing to engage in these conversations. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'm just going to share a few findings. I am happy to provide more resources after the fact. But what do children know and believe about race? All right, so children use race to process the world starting in infancy. So by age 3 months, infants prefer faces from particular racial groups. And by 9 months, those look like categories. And those categories map onto the categories that are present in their parents' kind of social group, if that makes sense. So this research happens in the US, it also happens internationally. Now, you may say, okay, that's like a really kind of low level thing. Surely like young children aren't thinking about the relationship between race and these larger structures that you guys have been talking about. Well, not so. So 3-year-olds are already paying attention to low versus high status racial groups, and they're associating low status racial groups within their community with negative traits. 3-year-olds. 4-year-olds are associating racial groups with high status markers, including political and economic markers. Okay, so these are preschoolers, and they are seeing a connection between the racial categories that are used in their environment and issues of economic and political status. Okay, so if we want to say that children aren't capable of thinking of complex issues like racism, I think this evidence really argues against it. They are thinking about race, and they're thinking about race plus power right here in preschool. As kids get older, we see that they become more willing to apply stereotypes to racial groups. That's when we first start seeing a lot of evidence of very frequent racial stereotyping. And in elementary school, I just want to name this fact, race-based discrimination is widespread. By some estimates, by age 10, 92% of Black Americans report having experienced explicit race-based discrimination by age 10. It's like a 5th grader. It's really young. So just to really briefly summarize what you now know based on this little mini quick presentation, children can and do use race to process the world. And I'll just say, if we don't talk with children about it, they can and will come to their own conclusions, right? Most children of color, and especially Black children, experience explicit race-related insults, discrimination, and overt bias before entering school. And I just want to highlight what that means. That means nearly every child will be a victim of, perpetrator of, or witness to these harmful events, right? Like no one isn't seeing these. They're here in elementary school. Talking about race with children is helpful for children of color. It is also helpful for white children. Again, there's like no false equivalence here where like one group is benefiting and a group is not. When we talk about race constructively, it improves outcomes for every group of children that we have measured. And avoiding talking about race causes children to believe that the topic isn't something that we talk about or learn about. And that does not help. As a parent, I want to say, like, there are a lot of reasonable concerns that adults may have about talking about race. It's hard. It is really, really hard. But just because a conversation may feel hard or uncomfortable, it doesn't mean we should avoid it. And there's a new study by Sylvia Perry, it's not published yet, that basically shows that the amount of discomfort and fear and like, this is too hard for me, that parents feel before having a conversation about race with their child does not predict how successful the conversation will be, right? So whatever your underlying anxieties may or may not be about engaging in these conversations doesn't tell you much about whether it will be successful, helpful, and productive. So that's what I have for you right now. I'll stop my share.
I just want to get, I think, just really robust information and important data. I want to give our panelists just an opportunity to react to that or add to anything that they saw in that presentation.
So I would say that, you know, right away, when you look at the fact, you know, and I'm familiar with these kinds of studies, you know, I love it. Thank you so much, because it just shuts down the discussion about, oh, you're going to hurt children, harm children. You know, look how early they already know the difference. And many of us have probably already heard about the doll baby studies, but, you know, just to even hear that at near months old, they notice difference. And I'll just keep stressing what Jess said previously. When you don't talk about it, they're learning it regardless. You know, it's no different, and I'm not steering the conversation differently, but as an educator, it's no different. Parents, right? I wrote a note. They don't want you to talk about it, so schools should talk about it. But then when the school talks about it, they're saying don't talk about it. They do the same thing with sex education. So many parents don't want to say anything to their kids, right? The school should do it. But then when the school starts teaching it, I didn't tell you to teach my kid. But nature is nature. They're going to learn from somebody. And so I would prefer that, you know, they learn things correctly and we have more open conversations when we're talking about race. And we prepare educators, you know, to learn, as Angela said, right? We can take the best parts of CRT. Angela, I actually worry that it's been so polarized and overhyped that people will think there's nothing good from it. I don't believe that. But, you know, yes, they do need these strategies. So that's why we're going to continue to need the experts to help educators so they can help teachers. Because as Jess is saying, if parents want teachers to teach this, then our teachers need to be equipped too, because they were those babies with the silence. I'm just going to keep repeating that.
Well, and I think it has really, that data just has really significant implications for early childhood educators. We won't spend time on that, but that was something I was really struck by. Angela, I think you wanted to chime in on this.
I was just saying that it shows the interdisciplinary approach of critical race theory, because a lot of it is drawing from this data. So it's very data driven in the way we develop principles, the way we apply the principles and the tools. So this is exactly what we're talking about, you know.
I think one of the things, Angela, that you just touched on is any critical theory, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's critical theory around gender studies, is retroactive, right? It's retrospective, I should say. It is trying to make sense of things that people have observed over time, patterns and trends, right? And so it's not created sort of in a vacuum and without context. And the thing that is missing as we're having these conversations is an understanding of the context of this American experiment, right? We have to go all the way back to the inception of this country and how people were treated and what the impact of that treatment has been and continues to be, right? And the stellar data that Jess just presented to us, you know, it just underscores how critically important it is, particularly for young children, to be engaged in this conversation, because absent that, they will begin to make their own assumptions. And if there is no conversation happening in the home, and if teachers are not given allowance to try to facilitate them, to your point, Dr. Hill, in the school, then they will just move through their lives, and end up making the decisions that we're talking about that continue to perpetuate legislation, that continue to perpetuate company policy, where people get to live, all manner of things, right? And so, while we are focused on the context of education, the implications, I mean, I think back to when we talk about just legislation, all the opportunity that has been lost on the basis of racial categorization, right? Going all the way back to, the creation of suburbs and who had access to home ownership, right? This is beyond education. This is but one slice and one sliver of how families have been impacted over time.
Absolutely. So y'all, I'm gonna change up our schedule a little bit. I'm gonna move into Q&A now, and then I'm gonna come back to just you all's closing remarks, because I think hearing the questions might add to your closing remarks. So I just want to start with, if anybody can shed some light on any recommendations that you have for parents of young children, like ways they can start the conversation. What are conversation starters?
I would say, so conversation started with an activity. So just in July, my wife and I went to Charleston, South Carolina, celebrate our anniversary. And, like any good educator, you travel to have fun and go learn something. So we went to the Slave Mart. I had never been there, right? It's now a museum, the last standing slave mart there in Charleston. And we went to a plantation. And one of the things that struck me, right, as I read everything there, was the overwhelming makeup of the population, which was white in those environments, in the slave mart and on the plantation when we went to the plantation. And I've commented a few times in different talks already that, one of the young white boys said to his mom, as they're reading the stuff in the slave mart, like, this is uncomfortable. And, his mom, without missing a beat, said, so imagine how they feel. And for me, that was amazing, right? It's like, so if you can't have the conversation as a sit down, like we do with our children. I have 3 daughters, and, my youngest, 15, she's already a social justice warrior. We talk, this is just regular, like, conversation, dinner, backyard, whatever. But if you can't do that as a parent, there are places where you can go where the environment in and of itself will spark the conversation. So talk about that relic. If you go to, I don't care if you go to, an art museum, talk about a Black artist. Like, do you see, what they're feeling in the art? But there are different things to help parents. They're not necessarily going to always sit down with a book. There are shows that come on, that you could watch. Sometimes, we need to go a little old school and sit down with our child and let's watch this program together and have a discussion. I remember my mom, I know it sounds crazy now at 53, but when Roots came out on television, that series in the 70s, and I was in elementary school, my brother and I, she made us sit down after each episode and we had a discussion. At the time I thought we had the worst mom ever, but that's real. And I've done the same thing with my daughters. And so parents, you can use all kinds of resources to spark conversations with your children.
Mm-hmm. Others, please feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of recommendations. One kind of trivial recommendation, but I'm just going to name drop it, is the Sesame Street Racial Justice Initiative online. You can go online. It is specifically designed to start these conversations among very young children. So I see some questions about, like, okay, my kid's 4. How do I start these conversations? If you're not sure, I actually think the Sesame Street materials are a fantastic starting point. There's also this kind of divide in types of conversations one might have that I kind of want to name. And one is proactive and one is reactive. And they both need to happen, right? So the proactive conversations are the ones that Dr. Hill was just talking about around the dinner table at particular events, intentional, planned, probably goal-directed in some way. And then there's the reactive conversations. And those are the ones where a child says something or something happens, and usually it's a negative something, and it must be addressed immediately. And my advice for parents is to, in those moments, if you're in a reactive situation, is to lean into the moment. Don't ignore it, don't avoid it. Even if the little panic sirens in your head say, run, 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 this is gonna be uncomfortable. Really quickly think to yourself, what about this needs to be addressed right now? And what about this is going to help me plan my proactive conversation that I'm going to have next week when I've had time to cool down, think about it, and prepare, right? And probably the part that needs to be addressed now is, was there any active harm done? Are there misunderstandings that need to be cleared up? Is there something that needs to be taught about vocabulary immediately? And the proactive stuff is going to be connecting it to these larger themes, getting materials. So respond to children's questions and comments, don't ignore them, but don't hold yourself accountable for responding to every piece of their comment in the moment, because you are not going to be in the best position to do that. For planned conversations, anticipate and prepare, right? If you're like me, maybe there's some learning that needs to happen, right? You realize you don't know the full answer, or you're not sure the best way to say something, and that's okay. Right? Say, I can have this conversation when I'm prepared to have it. I'm going to set a goal. It's going to be next week, and I'm going to do some learning and some thinking and some talking. I see a couple other questions that are kind of relevant to this question. Can I just like address a few of my responses to them?
Sure, go ahead.
So there were a lot of questions about like what to avoid in these conversations, and I'll let others add on to this as well. But I always recommend avoiding reducing race only to physical attributes or just labeling it, right? We know that that is what's called essentializing, and that can be very, very harmful. That doesn't mean you can never talk about a physical attribute, right? But it means when you reduce race to something so simple, you're removing all the richness that the child needs to learn about, right? And if you're looking for a topic, right? Like what can I teach my kid? Like one topic is just how to recognize racial bias, like how to just notice it. If you think that might be something that your child, and I'm speaking in particular to white parents here, that your child may not know how to recognize, that's a starting place. What does it look like? And young children in particular pay a lot of attention to fairness. You've probably heard them say, that's not fair. They care a lot about fair and equal and equity, and that is a fantastic window to start to talk about racism. Right, when we talk about fairness. So if you're not sure where to start, Sesame Street, thinking about fairness and responding in the moment when you have to, and giving yourself space to prepare for future conversations if you're not prepared to have the full talk right then.
Michelle, I want to give you a chance to chime in on this because I'm thinking about the work you all do, and that this mix up. How do you have this conversation with children if you're a parent, but also if you're an educator?
That's right. Thank you for that distinction, Erin. So, when we are doing this work, part of how we engage, and we do have actual separate forums, right, for parents and for educators, or for family and for educators, because you're going to bring a different perspective, a different lens, and a different set of objectives, right, to that conversation. But for anyone that we have conversations with, whether they are educators, whether they are caregivers, family members, administrators, whomever they are, we begin with an understanding of who you are. You can't have a conversation with kids about their race or their experience of race or racism if you have not socially located yourself. What do you understand about your own racial identity? How far can you go back to understand, when was I first conscious about race? When was I first, to Jess's point about being able to recognize bias, when was the first time I noticed that something seemed unfair, and that it seemed unfair for certain kinds of people? Right? And if you are not present to that, not only are you going to leapfrog over your own development, but you may in fact end up doing harm to young people, because you will appear, to Jess's point, we know the kids notice everything. They notice everything, and they know when you're not being straight with them, as young as, as they have language to be able to say, I don't think that is true, or that doesn't line up with my experience of reality, right? And so the first piece is to really get present to your own racial identity and what it has meant for you. I think, to dovetail with some of the things that Jess has shared, coming from a space of inquiry, right? We often, as a parent, my child is very vocal and he is very curious and inquisitive. And so he may ask questions about things in public that I may not necessarily want to talk about and or answer in the moment. But the last thing we need to do is shut kids down when they ask these questions, to come from a place of inquiry, particularly if you are within, your own home and you feel like you've got some spaciousness to have that conversation. Well, that's an interesting thing you just said, or that you've asked, why do you think that? Or where did that come from? The other thing that's helpful about that, in addition to building relationship between you and the child, is that it allows you the opportunity to perhaps identify where some of those ideas are coming from. And if those ideas are coming from your home, if they're coming from somewhere else, if they are being perpetuated in the school building, in the school community, in other places where you may be in community, that's incredibly helpful to know, because it may give you some insight into what that child's experience is when they are not with you, right? So understanding sort of where the questions are coming from, being able to answer them from your own experience and say, well, when I was your age, or when I was younger, or as I think about these things, and all of course it boils down to what is, quote unquote, developmentally appropriate, but curiosity and connectedness are always developmentally appropriate.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. There's something about this idea of children are curious. How do we as adults remain curious? How do we continue to learn and remain open in order to meet our children's curiosity? Like, I think that's really a great way of framing that. So this has come up. This may go to Dr. Hill or Angela, maybe both of you. We have a question about, how do you simply explain the difference between critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching?
Angela, you want to start and hit the critical, because I'm gonna come backwards from the culture responsive
All
to
right.
critical race theory.
And I was going to say, I can't really speak to culturally responsive teaching, because that is a much broader educational tool or approach. Critical race theory tends to focus on race and the role of race in structures. That's sort of boiling it down to its essentials. And so I think that's very different than trying to, you speak to that, Dr. Hill.
Well, thank you, Angela. So that's exactly how I was feeling, right? Because I understand what critical race theory is, and I understand that we don't teach it at our level. And it's, again, like I said at the beginning, it's just crazy that people keep going there. So with culturally relevant, it's like I use these examples when I talk to parents. I just had a talk with parents and community members this past Friday. We can all say, when you went to school in America, and I picked a woman who clearly was, much older than me, and I said, I bet you read Tom Sawyer. I bet you read, Huck Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird. All these. She's like, yeah. And I said, so, and so have my children now. And there's probably a 7-year difference. But I'm like, so when do we get to read things about people who look like us, and not in the negative, right? We weren't always slaves. We actually write books. Like, I didn't get to read any of Toni Morrison's books when I was in school. Everything I read of Toni Morrison was when I went to graduate school, and Mike Dyson and Cornel West and Skip Gates. And I actually had to fight in grad school at UMass Amherst, put my school on blast, love it, but put them on blast. I had to fight to get those books added. And I'm like, people, when we come to school, students bring their whole selves to school. And what we tend to do in education is we make them choose. If you get to stay yourself and it's going to be a miserable experience, or I think Jess and Michelle said, they mentioned that people want to go to the melting pot theory, right? Or you let yourself melt away and trick your mind into believing that you are the same as that other classmate. And it really doesn't matter what you read. It really doesn't matter, the artifacts that your teacher shows you. It really doesn't matter the places that you're allowed to visit that are considered educationally valuable. But it does when you have culturally responsive education. Mm-hmm. So we don't just go to a Sturbridge Village or this particular museum. We're going to find where the Amistad is docked, and we're going to go there. We're going to find where Black artists' artwork is displayed, and we're going to go there. We're going to find the books that have Latinx authors, and we're going to read those books. And shocking to some people out there, they're in English. You can read the book. Because they have a Latinx name doesn't mean, well, I don't know Spanish. Yeah, okay. You don't know Russian either, but you read Tolstoy. So I'm like, that's what the culture responsive piece is. And again, as we've all said, as people continue to conflate, and I call it intellectual filibuster. They just try to throw up a smoke screen to keep you fussing and arguing over here. But in schools, we're going to continue to teach and push for a culturally responsive curriculum. And that's what we're doing now. And that's what we're going to do. And I'm just talking for Windsor. I'm not speaking for the district that way. I'm speaking for public education. That's what we're doing. And it's not critical race theory.
And can I just add, if I had more time to talk about critical race theory, I think my answers would make more sense. But the way I look at critical race theory is it is a way to answer the question why.
Mhm.
So why do we have the wealth gap disparity? Why do we have different outcomes in healthcare? Why do we have segregated neighborhoods? And so critical race theory looks at the why to try to figure out how can we reconstruct it.
Mhm.
And so that's very different than the culturally sensitive or appropriate teaching that's doing a very different thing.
Mhm.
But Angela, I'll say this, you are 100%. And so that's why it's under attack, right? When people really, if they dig into it, because they don't want a why, right? They don't want to get to the why. Because
They have a why, but they don't want to acknowledge that the why is racist.
That's
And
absolutely.
the why is often, well, because that group doesn't work hard enough, or well, it's because they don't have the right parents in the home, and then when we drill down on, well, what do you mean by that? It is because of the way we categorize races.
Mhm.
And when we have to really look at that and confront that, it becomes uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And you don't want to consider that there's actually a whole structure in place. In
There's a
society
structure that created
that undergirds all of it.
Right.
And whenever a crack happens in that structure or foundation, new laws are put in place to literally
Right.
patch it up. But
I had someone ask me, how could we, at a presentation I did, well, how can you say we have racist laws when our laws don't refer to race? And I said, they don't have to now. They can be strategic enough to not refer to race and still have a racist outcome.
Mhm. So this is going to be my last question for you all, and I appreciate in just the Q&A the way you all have added some solutions, like ways forward for people. That's always really important to us in these conversations. We want to provide understanding for people, or opportunities for understanding for folks, but we also want to turn towards solutions. And I've seen this question come up a few times in the chat. So I'm going to ask this. Based on your experience, based on your expertise, your lived experience as well, not just professional, what is the way forward? What steps can we take to address the attacks on critical race theory? So I am going to start with Angela.
I have an acronym, I call it ERA, E-R-A. I think it's first educate ourselves about what it is and what it isn't, and have a fundamental understanding of what race and racism is and what it isn't. Then raise our resilience, get tolerant of the discomfort that comes with discussing race. Just get comfortable with that, and then apply those two to strategic solutions. So educate ourselves, raise our resilience, and apply solutions.
Thank you for that. Dr. Hill, what steps do you recommend we take going forward when attacks on critical race theory come up?
So I'm going to be, I have loved what Angela has been saying for sure. But when I know I'm dealing with people who just really don't get it for the most part, Angela, I'll just say, because that's typically who I'm going to deal with. I have stressed, I'm not engaging that conversation on critical race theory. I pivot very quickly, and I actually go to, so what is it that you actually have an issue with students being taught in our schools? Tell me what your issue is. Don't say critical race theory because you're giving me a talking point, right? A flashpoint. Tell me what it is. I don't like when you teach my child this. That's what I want to know. And that's how I've been engaging people. Like, we're not teaching critical race theory, so you don't have to keep citing, Fox News to me. So tell me what it is that you believe we're teaching. I separate the facts from the myth. And that's how I've been doing. And that's just been my approach for years doing equity and diversity work. Like, tell me what you think you know, which I think it does connect to what Angela said. She just has a much cleaner way of doing it. I love it, era, you know, and I'm like, then I'm just going to tell you where you're wrong or where you're actually correct. And then we're going to move forward where we can find some common ground, but keep moving you forward. And as Jess said, you have to continue to educate yourself because you're not going to know it all.
Mhm. Jess.
Yeah, I mean, I am a big fan of, because I am in a position where I can choose which conversations to have. It's different. I don't have parents coming to my door. I go out onto the Facebook groups all the time and I'm like, I hear someone being like, oh, critical race theory, not in my school. And then I'm like, hi, my name is Jess. Would you like to have a Zoom conversation with me and we can talk about this one-on-one? And that is an interesting approach with very mixed success. There's like 3 outcomes. One possible outcome is they were like, oh no, someone's engaging with me on this. No, I don't want to talk, right? And then maybe they've had a moment and realized like the thing I have a problem with isn't critical race theory and this conversation is not going to be productive. Thing two that can happen is a very productive conversation, right? There are a lot of wrong things out there about critical race theory, about what racism is, right? These topics, there are narratives that people pay a lot of money to put out there to teach you wrong things about them, right? And so people often are reacting to something that isn't even in the theory or isn't even in anything that any of us on this panel would ever want to teach. And so those conversations are very productive. And then of course, there are the unproductive but uncomfortable conversations where we keep asking each other why, and hopefully clarifying the language, right? At least making sure we're talking about the same thing. So that's what I've been doing, but most of my stuff that I do is with the kids, right? Kids are, I mean, it's so cheesy, but kids are the future, right? And so as a parent, I am spending my time making sure that my children are thinking critically about the stuff they're being taught in school. For example, we look at the assignments, we look at, oh, like Columbus Day, like, let's look at this. Let's think about what stories are here, what stories aren't here. How does this play out today, right? Connect it to stuff in our local community, and have those active conversations, because even if my generation isn't going to be the one to effectively change the way our legal and political system works, you know, maybe my kids' generation will be, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Optimism.
Optimism is good. Don't let it go. Michelle.
I get right back to curiosity and inquiry, right? I mean, one of the community agreements that we have as we engage folks in our trainings and workshops is that they should expect and accept non-closure, right? Like you should expect that you're going to come to this conversation and you may not get the answers, right, that you're looking for. And so I think to Dr. Hill's point about, what is it that you're afraid of? When folks are adamant about this, they're either they're erecting a boundary, right? And that boundary is either to keep something out or to keep something in, right? And the keeping something out and the keeping something in frequently has to do with destabilizing their worldview and somehow invalidating the experience that they have had to date. So, for folks who are sort of attacking critical race theory, there's a question there around what are you afraid of, right? And then there is a sort of corollary to that, which is what are you aware of? Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right, which 50 years, last year was the 50th anniversary of the English translation of that. He talks about this critical consciousness that we have to have. How do we take in the things that we're seeing in the world? And to Jess's very good point, there are folks who are happy to just absorb and sponge and not interrogate, not inquire, not question, not understand why this is so salient or resonant for me. Why does this appeal to me, right? And so without that consciousness, without inquiry, without curiosity, and without being very honest about what the fears are, we will continue to find ourselves in this cycle of responding to flashpoints, things that serve as a proxy. This conversation is a red herring for something much larger that we as a nation have yet to reckon with.
Absolutely. Y'all, I just want to say thank you for the conversation. I also want to name, even though we won't have time to discuss it, I want to name that we have talked very much in many ways about how white folks, how white parents can move into these kinds of conversations. We've talked about critical race theory and colorblindness and fear around conversations about race and racism being something in particular that white folks in this country struggle with. We didn't get to discuss this, but I want to name that there are children of color. There are Black children, Latinx children, AAPI children, Native American children, an array of children who are not being seen. Their families are not being seen and heard in these conversations. And I don't want us to forget that this larger conversation that's happening, where we see white folks, where we see white race, where we see this thing that is not actually happening in our schools being centered, what does it mean for our children of color? And how do we make sure that they are not lost in these conversations, and that they and their families are taken care of, and that their stories and that their counter narratives are something that we continue to make room for, get out of the way for, because sometimes we're just in the way, and that we make sure that they're cared for in the midst of all that is happening around us right now. I want to just say in conclusion, thank you for the rich conversation. Thank you for your transparency. Thank you for saying things that may not have been hard for you to say, but may have been hard for people to hear, and you said it anyway. I want to thank everybody in our audience that attended. I know that we had more than 300 people who registered for this event, which speaks volumes about people looking for information that they may not be getting elsewhere. By the end of this week, our registrants, you all will receive what we call our post-event toolkit. It's going to include slides. It's going to include resources. I saw folks asking about books that they can read, and it really builds on this conversation. It will have our panelists' bios in it, and it will have tonight's conversation. The video recording will also be in that. So you all will have access to that information. And I also want to say in conclusion, this was a statewide event, as you heard on the front end, with all of the YWCAs here in Connecticut. And I just want to thank my sister YWCAs for this partnership. I thank you for all the ways that we got to work together to put on this amazing event. Thank you again to our speakers. I loved this conversation, loved the data, loved the transparency, loved all of it. And so I know we will stay in touch. Keep doing the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you for your bravery. And thank you for pushing us toward what I know we hope is an anti-racist future that we get to benefit from. I don't want to keep saying not in my lifetime. Hopefully we get to see some of these benefits in our lifetime. So everybody have a good night, and thanks for coming.